Chapter 9. King Melchizedek had called a council of all his highest-ranking men. He sat with them in the council chambers to discuss what must be done. To his right was Joab, the general. Beside him, Reuben, the captain of the guard. Daniel and Solomon were there as advisors. Deborah, who had served as a magistrate when the king was at war. And lastly, Eli, although it was largely understood that Eli was not to speak, but only to bring the message of the council to the people. Miriam was always welcome at the king's side. However, she had opted to spend the time alone, tending to Sarah's garden. Reuben had explained how his men were positioned on the castle walls and around the perimeter, as well as that Hezekiah's tunnel had been opened to allow water to come immediately into the castle. Only members of the council and the royal family knew where either end of the tunnel was, to ensure that it could not be blocked to prevent the water from flowing. Joab and his men had not had so easy a time. There was considerable resistance to bringing everyone inside the castle walls. Even some of the soldiers did not agree that this was the best plan. It could not be brought about quickly at any rate. There needed to be enough food for all to last who knows how long, and while the king had good storehouses, they would quickly run out of meat and wine. It was Ammon the baker who was particularly resistant to the whole idea. Sure, there was grain and supplies and ovens all within the castle, but it was the principle of the thing. Ammon was headstrong, but a natural leader and popular with the town people. He did not feel they needed the king's protection or the castle walls, and that they would be abandoning certain securities and comforts unnecessarily. In the end, there was a general uneasiness in the village, and yet very little movement. Some, who at first had heeded the instructions to evacuate, ended up returning to the village because so many others had not yet obeyed. Farmers would not leave their farms. The harvest was coming in. Many began to question even the validity of the story. Sure, many thought they had seen a dragon, but it was just a dumb, distant animal that couldn't possibly win against an entire kingdom. Perhaps it has been so long since we've last had a real battle that the people have begun to underestimate the enemy, Daniel said. I agree, Joab said. As a people, we've grown fat and comfortable. Maybe a good conflict is exactly what we need. Perhaps, said Melchizedek. Nonetheless, I am surprised by their insolence, said Deborah. These people love you, your majesty. Surely they would obey you out of love, even if they disagreed. Love is not enough, Joab said. They need respect. They may love their king, but they do not fear him. They have forgotten that he is not merely a benevolent father figure, but also a fierce warrior. I've ordered my men to take the people by force into the castle. No, Melchizedek said. They must choose it. Otherwise there will be a rebellion among them. Give them 1 day. After that, the doors will have to be closed. The longer they remain open, the more vulnerable we are to spies and traitors. Eli, it is up to you to spread the word. Yes, your majesty, Eli said. I think some of them may object to your invitation for other reasons, said Solomon, choosing his words carefully. You've not displayed your power for some time, your majesty. Perhaps the people have found other power, one that better protects their own self-interest. What do you mean? Daniel asked suspiciously. Asherah poles. The baker has erected one, Solomon began. Treason, Joab declared. His Majesty has strictly forbidden the use of that witch's charms, and she has been banished. I will have the men arrest the baker immediately. I don't think that is a good idea, Solomon said. The poles do have power, the nature of which we do not yet understand. Whether it is supernatural or merely powerful as a symbol, I do not assume to know. But it is because of the power or perceived power that His Majesty banned them in the first place. If we start arresting our own citizens while attempting to corral them into the castle, this may only deepen the strife amongst the people. Tolerance and a level head are necessary here. I am not afraid of the power of Asherah, Joab spat. Know this, Solomon answered. It is not mere physical power that can be found in the poles. It is wisdom itself that is found there. Perhaps, General, you should have erected one yourself. Daniel interjected before General Joab had the opportunity. Isn't it strange that men would do something so very unwise in order to seek wisdom? If I may, Deborah began. We must order the poles to be cut down. The people who've erected them can cut their own down, and in this way prove their loyalty to the king in a time when fidelity will be of paramount importance." "I agree," Melchizedek said. "The poles themselves are a threat to our kingdom. They must be destroyed. I expect resistance, but we can't compromise on this. Eli, your edict now states that all Asherah poles are to be cut down by those who erected them, and all citizens are to come into the castle walls before the gates are closed tomorrow at sundown. Any who are prepared to come sooner are invited to do so." "And what if they do not obey your orders?" Joab asked. "Those who will not obey me or accept my protection are beyond my help. So be it for them," Melchizedek said. With that, the issue was settled. The council dispersed, each to his own duties. Eli was given an escort of 2 guards for his task of bringing the edict to the people. Eli left the confines of the castle and went straight to the village square. On a typical day, people would be milling about, selling their wares and socializing, but today there was no market. Instead, people stood in hushed groups. Women and children spoke to one another on the outer edges of the square, while in the middle, around the statue of Melchizedek mounted on a horse that stood there, many of the men were gathered in what was a council of their own. Though he had royal authority, and everyone knew that, Eli was suddenly grateful for the escort of 2 guards. Caleb and Gideon were both good warriors and faithful to the king. But then, it had always seemed to Eli that most of the townspeople were faithful. But what had happened in these past few days seemed to demonstrate otherwise. It was clear that Eli, with his scroll and demeanor, was there on official business, and soon everyone was pressing in to hear what he would say. He pulled himself up to the base of the statue so that everyone could see him. The villagers knew that he had just been in the council with the king. They wanted to know the plan. Once the people had quieted down sufficiently, Eli opened his scroll and began reading. "Thus says your king, the times are not safe. We have reason to believe that an attack by our enemies is imminent. For your own protection, you are invited to come into the confines of the castle walls. We are making preparations to ensure that we will have enough food and water to last several weeks, and you will be well protected there. However, we recognize that many preparations must be made. Thus, we will give you 1 full day to come into the castle before we will shut the gates. Our soldiers have already gone into the village in order to offer security and assistance with this transition. Disorder will not be tolerated." A murmur of discontent arose among the people upon hearing the plan. Eli glanced up and saw many stern faces. In particular, he noticed that of Ammon the baker, who, head and shoulders above most, could be seen at the back of the crowd, arms crossed, shaking his head. Nonetheless, Eli continued. "Moreover, it is the express command of the king that any who have erected poles in honor of the witch Asherah remove these immediately. They must be chopped down, or brought to the town square, where they shall be promptly destroyed." Some of the villagers looked surprised at the idea that such poles existed in the village. Ammon and some of the men nearest him looked bemused. Once the edict was finished being read, most of the villagers went about doing as they were instructed. However, Ammon approached Eli along with his entourage. Among them were many prominent men, the blacksmith, the butcher, several merchants, and notably, Sheriff Jeroboam. Ammon spoke. "And what would happen to us if we do not obey the king?" Eli answered, "It is the expectation of the king and the council that all will obey him. As such, no consequences have been determined, as these will be unnecessary." Ammon shook his head again. "Do you really think that we can simply shut down the market because of the threat of some lizard? If there are dragons attacking us, let the king produce them then. But for my part, I've seen no such thing. These stories of a coming war are nothing more than fear-mongering." Eli said, "If you do not intend to obey the king, this is your choice, but you will place yourself outside the protection of the king." "We do not need his protection," Ammon replied. "We are powerful people, more powerful than you perhaps know. Come, Eli, let us compare power, shall we?" "We know that you have an Asherah pole," Eli said. "We know where your power comes from. It is witchcraft, and it is evil, as all witchcraft is evil. This is why the king has forbidden it." "No," Aemon said. "The king has forbidden it because he knows that if we have power, we will be like him, and we will not have to obey him." Jeroboam looked at Gideon and said, "Gideon, you yourself have an Asherah pole, is that not correct?" Gideon looked at Eli and Caleb, then down at the ground before he answered, "I do." Jeroboam went on, "And do you intend to destroy it?" Gideon answered, "I believe in obedience. Because the king has ordered it, I'll do it." Jeroboam was surprised by this, and he sneered as he said, "But you've risen in the ranks because of it. Don't forget, we know who you are. You are no warrior. Now you will throw that all away for a king who offers you no power in return?" "Yes," Gideon said. Here his confidence increased. "It's true what Eli said. The power in the poles is evil. I know what they can do. Moreover, I know that those who use the power do not control it, but it controls them. I've already resolved to have my pole destroyed, and so to once again gain my independence." Here the men grew suddenly and inexplicably angry. "How dare you? You calling us slaves? Who are you to condemn us?" Aemon stared Eli in the eyes and said, "Sheriff, if these two guards will not use the power of Asherah, then let us use it against them. I suggest we bind Eli and throw him in prison. Let these guards go to their king, and we'll see how merciful the king will be to those who fail in their mission." Eli answered boldly, "You would not dare lay your hands on me. Sheriff, you would have no authority if it were not given you by the king. You know that as the king's messenger, I am his representative. To arrest me without cause is to pit yourself against the king. It is treason, and you will all be considered outlaws." "We are not subject to your laws," Jeroboam said. "Arrest him. Do as Aemon says." For a moment after these instructions, nobody moved. Caleb and Gideon each reached for their swords to defend Eli, but suddenly they stopped. Their arms felt heavy, their muscles weak. Eli watched in stunned horror as each fell to the ground, their faces contorted in slow, inarticulate groans. It was as though they had gone completely numb and were unable to support themselves. Yet no one had touched them. "You see, gentlemen, this is the power of Asherah," Aemon said, his hand stretched toward the fallen guards. "I have the ability to overpower even the mighty warriors with my mind alone. And this says nothing of the extraordinary strength, agility, and skill she can give us. I'm very grateful that Eli has given us this opportunity to demonstrate the power." Then to Eli he said, "Can your king do this?" "I know that my king can do much greater things even than this," Eli said, "but do not push his hand." "Arrest him," Aemon said. Emboldened by this display of power, unarmed merchants grabbed hold of Eli while the king's guards watched helplessly from the ground. Eli was taken to the dungeon where he was locked in. "Perhaps we will release you tomorrow night, once the castle gates are locked. Then you'll be outside the king's protection, as we are," Jeroboam scoffed. Caleb and Gideon were left lying in the square where their strength slowly recovered. In time they were able to stand. "Come," said Caleb, "we must tell the king what has happened." "If I had used Asherah's power just now, I could have resisted them," Gideon said. "So, what are you planning to do?" Caleb asked. "I'm more determined than ever to destroy the pole in my own courtyard," Gideon said. "After we report to King Melchizedek, come, help me chop it down, and we can bring it here to the square to destroy it. I don't know if I'll have the strength on my own. Let us hope that it will be the first in a major bonfire. Then we can see about freeing Eli." Chapter 10. Holophony sat staring at the ground, saying nothing. He had sat like this for most of the day, not even whittling anymore with his knife. Sarah kept looking for an opportunity to talk to him. Maybe she could convince him that the plan of the dragons was weak, and that he should work for his own benefit. Maybe then she could then use him to get back to her father. She still did not know what her own role was to be in the plan of Ra. In the evening, as the sun was beginning to set, a couple of things began to happen. One was a steady, horrible beating drum somewhere in the camp. Sarah looked at Holofernes to question what that was, but he only stared more intently at the ground. The other was that several dragons flew over the camp, carrying Mazakim on their backs and in their claws. It was clear that stage 1 of the plan had begun. Moreover, it was clear that Sarah had little time to waste. "The plan will fail," she said. Holofernes did not respond. "Ra's plan," she began again, "involves the rejection of the king by his villagers. It will not work. The villagers love their king." No answer. "Ra does not understand the nature of the kingdom. It's not about fear and power, but about loyalty and love. The only way that his plan would work is if there was a wholesale rejection of the king already by the people. And I know these people. They have not rejected their king." Holofernes stood suddenly and walked over to a tent. "Atalia, bring out the boy." A woman came out, unclean and unkempt, like the rest of the people in the camp. She was followed by a boy about 9 years old. The boy wore no shirt and had a design painted on his chest and face in red paint. His arms were bound behind his back. Both he and the woman had reddish eyes as if they'd been crying. Both looked angry. "Holofernes, you will not do this thing," she said. "Quiet, woman. This is necessary." "He is your son." "And you are my wife. You'll do as I tell you." Sarah recognized the boy as being one of the ones that had tormented her earlier that day. Suddenly she felt pity for him, but he glared at her with hatred. "Why don't you sacrifice the princess instead?" the boy said. Holofernes looked as though he were considering this option, but then he said, "No, it won't work. I'm sorry, Zedekiah, but this is how it must be." "I hate you," the child said, but he did not try to run. Now 2 more men came and said to Holofernes, "Let's get this over with." "What about her?" Holofernes said, jerking his head towards Sarah. "Bring her. Ra wants her to witness the sacrifice." Then the man who had been speaking said to Sarah, "You haven't seen anything yet." They bound her the same way as the boy, with her hands tied behind her back and a kind of leash attached to her hands such that she could not run. The woman, Athalia, handed the leash of the boy to Holofernes. The boy looked at her. "Mother," was all he said, a monotone word devoid of emotion. "It's too late," she said through gritted teeth, and so the procession began. Holofernes himself led the procession, followed by 2 other armed men, and the guard holding the leash on Zedekiah, who naturally followed. Then another guard, who held the leash on Sarah. Athalia, the mother, was not part of the procession. Holofernes led them through the tent village and began to ascend an embankment. Sarah could see ahead of them that all the people of the camp had gathered, and many were carrying torches. There was a steady drumbeat, and as they came to the top of the hill, Sarah saw that the beat was being pounded out on large drums by men wearing nothing but loincloths, their faces and bodies painted for war. Women began a kind of high-pitched yelling or calling and danced to the beat of the drums. The noise ebbed and flowed, and it seemed as though the crowd itself were pulsing, surging, and heaving like the ocean in a storm. At first it seemed that the people were illuminated by a bonfire over the top of the hill. But as they walked closer, Sarah discovered that the fire was in fact in the mouth of a great statue. The statue was of a dragon, though it was many times larger than a real dragon. It stood below the hilltop on all fours, its head tilted upwards, and fire spewing from its mouth. Sarah could see men working below, near the abdomen of the dragon, throwing in wood and stoking the furnace, which already blazed such that you could feel the heat as soon as you stepped into its formidable light. The aisle that the procession followed wound through the crowd and towards the dragon. There before them was a stone staircase which led nowhere. It dropped to nothing in front of and above the dragon. At the top of the staircase stood a man wearing a great fur cape and a bull skull for a helmet. He had a staff in his hand which was crowned with what looked like a human skull, though smaller. He was decorated with necklaces and other jewelry made of bones. It was clear that he was to preside over the assembly. The drummers, who stood on either side of the staircase with the flames lighting them from behind, began to accelerate their drumming. The crowd began shouting and calling louder and dancing more frantically. Sarah felt rising in her a sense of fear and horror, and something else she did not know, something like revulsion mixed with attraction and excitement. She suddenly realized that it was this other feeling that the people were engorged in that made them dance and scream and sacrifice. And she decided to suppress these feelings. She sought strength and a means to escape. Suddenly, there was silence. A signal by the drummers and the raising of the arms of the man on the stairs made everyone stop chanting and screaming and dancing. Instead, they looked to the man on the stairs who spoke loud so all could hear. "This night, we go into battle," he declared. The people cheered. He continued, "The dragons demand a sacrifice, and we shall not disappoint them. We need the power of the dragons if we are to be victorious. I, Haman, high priest of Molech," the crowd repeated the name, Molech, in a kind of hushed chant, but only once, and bowed in unison. "I have chosen for us a sacrifice. Where is the man, Holofernes?" He asked this, though Holofernes clearly stood at the foot of the stairs. Holofernes responded loudly, "I am here, and I am prepared to do all things the dragons bid me." "Holofernes, bring me the boy," Haman yelled. The crowd erupted into loud cheering, and the screams started again. Holofernes took the leash of Zedekiah and began to lead him up the stairs. The guard stood at the bottom of the stairs to prevent the boy from escaping, or anyone from preventing the sacrifice. But there was no resistance. Sarah looked around desperately for someone to put a stop to this. She saw Atalia standing in the crowd, but near the aisle where she could see. She was not crying, but she stared at the top of the staircase with hatred in her eyes. There appeared to be no dragons or Mazzikim anywhere in the crowd. The boy was at the top of the stairs now. His legs had grown weak as he mounted, and his father half dragged, half carried him up the top half of the stairs. The heat there was so intense that the three on the stairs appeared to sway as the air in front of them distorted their images. Sarah felt her chest constricting. Breathing came hard. Her hands were tightly fisted. Haman removed his headgear and placed it onto Holofernes, then gave Holofernes the staff. The drums started in again, on a 1-2 beat now, but accentuating the first beat with 2 hits, one upon the other, and leaving the second beat with silence. The effect was that the drums sounded like a heart beating just slightly fast. Sarah found that her own heart soon matched the beat. Doom, doom. Doom, doom. But the beat was accelerating. The crowd pressed in tighter. Holofernes raised his staff in the air. Zedekiah faced outwards, his face a mask of rebellion and hatred. His back was to the furnace, and he stood right on the precipice. One hit from Holofernes, and the boy would fall right into the mouth of the dragon. Holofernes swung. Sarah closed her eyes, not wanting to see this act of evil, as though closing her eyes would somehow shield her from the stain of an evil so thick she was nearly swimming in it. She heard the sickly sound of cracking bones and the scream of the boy. The crowd again erupted into roars of approval. Sarah opened her eyes and saw that there was now only 2 figures on the stairs. The boy was gone. The crowd around screamed and roared and danced and chanted the name, Molech! Then the drums once more gave the signal, and Haman, who had taken back his headgear and his staff, raised his arms in the air for silence. "Another sacrifice," he declared. The crowd roared, and suddenly Sarah felt herself being dragged up the stairs by the leash on her wrists. Sarah pulled back and tried to resist. Guards closed in behind her, cutting off her escape. She looked desperately for help, but there was none to be found. Holofernes walked by her, going down the stairs, but did not look at her. The guard continued to drag her up the stairs. She mustered all of her strength and began to pull back. A second guard ran to help the first and picked her up off the ground, throwing her over his shoulder. Looking down, Sarah could see Sanballat arguing with the guards at the bottom of the stairs. "This is not supposed to happen," he was saying, but the guards would not let him prevent it. Sarah was placed on her feet at the top of the stairs, but she fell to her knees. She could feel the immense heat at her back. The drums started with their mock heartbeat. Haman raised his staff. Faster and faster the drums went. Sarah closed her eyes once more. Suddenly there was a commotion in the crowd. The drums stopped. Sarah opened her eyes to see Molech, the real Molech, landing beside her on the stairs. There was barely room for the dragon and the priest and the princess at the top of the stairs. "What are you doing?" Molech asked the priest. Haman had a look of terror on his face. "I, sire, was going to sacrifice her to your honor." "We have other plans for her." I didn't know. She came bound. I thought." But Molech picked the man up in his teeth and threw him into the furnace below. Then he looked into the crowd, and finding Holofernes, he said, "You, take your prisoner and guard her this time." With that, the dragon turned and flew off, his mission accomplished. Sarah felt faint. The two guards who had brought her up the stairs quickly ran to grab her and bring her back down. She was brought to Holofernes, who angrily took her leash and once more led her to the post where she'd been bound all day.